Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Elisa Sklar. I am the Vice President of Marketing for GIS Planning, and I'm very delighted to have you all here today with us. I'm very pleased to get started on today's webinar called The Next 25 Years of Retail, Prepare for the Future of Retail and Mixed-Use Development. And so without any further ado, I would like to welcome today's presenter. We're very pleased to have Matthew Wynn with us today of Win-Win Consulting. Matthew is was the COO of Olshan Properties, the global retail COO and head of the Americas retail brokerage and consulting platforms at Cushman & Wakefield, where he led a global team of approximately 900 retail professionals in over 20 countries on 4 continents, and a vice president at Starwood Capital Group. His recent work has included asset management for groups like Oliver Macmillan, as well as advisor work for restaurateurs, retailers, and developers to enhance underperforming mixed-use real estate and retail concepts. In addition to his work at Win-Win, he is currently the Chief Development Officer for Maple and Ash, a new steakhouse focused on women and foodies, and a strategic advisor to Octopoda LLC for a new line of authentic Greek products at supermarkets in the New York City area. Matthew, we are very excited to have you with us today. Hello.
Elisa, hi. Great to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
So, Matthew, what I'm going to do is pass over the control of the dashboard here so that you'll be able to walk us through the slides that you've got. I'll be keeping an eye on our questions, and I will turn this over to you.
Great. Thanks again for having me today. Hopefully everybody can see the screen here. I am thrilled to be with you all today. Elisa and I...
There we go. I am able to see your screen. Sorry, just took an extra moment there.
All right, good. So it's interesting. When I looked at the title of this, I know we talked about sort of planning for the next 25 years. But originally what Elisa and I had talked about was sort of putting the retail evolution to work for your community. You know, the best thing about preparing for the next 25 years, as I tell my children, is I can say whatever I want and you can't prove me wrong. So what I'm going to try to do is actually give you practical advice rather than some musings about the next 25 years. But before we get started, I thought let's establish a good baseline for sort of where we are. This property is Siegen Lane in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. It was owned by the Olshan family. Originally, when they bought it in 1983, it was an enclosed regional mall of roughly 1 million square feet that got redeveloped into what's been the retail construct for the last 25 years, which is the Power Center, a grouping of big box retailers, all large formats where their inventory is kept on the floor. And the idea was, before the invention of the internet, this is where you went for maximum selection. So rather than having to go store by store and individually, the way you would in a traditional Main Street, you went to these power centers to get everything that you needed at value pricing. And so that's the retail world that we lived in up until the Great Recession. And then 10 years ago, we had the Lehman meltdown. And I think it's interesting that I get to give this talk at a time where we're sort of celebrating that evolution and looking at what happened. And we're really looking at a consumer that changed the way that they shopped, and it still is a generational shift in what happened and the way that they approach the needs for goods and services. And that's because not only do they live in a world that is increasingly anxious in terms of the complexity of what's happening on a global basis and locally, but also just making ends meet has become more and more of an issue. It used to be that we segregated our population into 3 different groups. You had the upper class, the middle class, and the lower class. Now there's 5 different segmentations. We talk about quintiles in terms of consumer spending in this new economy. And in all of those groups, from top to bottom, we talk about people being worried about being able to cover their monthly expenses. It was estimated recently that 40% of Americans don't have $1,000 to spend if they had a medical emergency. But now what's interesting is when you look at sort of where people are predicting is going to happen when we look at the next 25 years, is it's all about these tools and these expensive ways of approaching what was traditionally a very consumer-oriented group that retailed directly from person to person. Well, the reason people have shopped has not changed. There are three reasons that you go to the store, which is one, I need it, and that's that convenience retail, and whether that's your grocery anchored shopping center, your power center, or just the local standalone drugstore, all those things you want to be near where you are. And their traditional location pattern was, I'm going to be halfway between your home and your office. If you're Starbucks, let's say, for example, you want to make sure you're on the drive time side of the street for the morning commute because that increased your sales by about 20%. And it was all driven by how many people were in an area. Then you've got sort of the I want it group of folks where things were more value oriented. There was some discretion in the way that you were spending. And that was our traditional enclosed mall and the lifestyle center. And then you have this whole new group of retailers that's recently popped up, which is the I feel it. What is the experience around it? And can you drive shopping? So traditionally, this was dominated by places like Miami or the souvenir shops when you went on vacation and you wanted to bring home a memento, whether that was maple syrup from Canada, a t-shirt from Paris, or authentic chopsticks from Japan and China. All those were examples of experiential retail. And we're seeing the rise of a different kind of tenant because of that. And part of that may be the way that we're growing as a generation. So when you look at these different pieces, you can track the evolution of retail a little bit by tracking what's happening with the baby boomer generation. So as the baby boomers parents moved out to the suburbs, you saw the rise of what is now called traditional retail development, those open air grocery anchored shopping centers, the enclosed mall, and then eventually the power center. And now as they move back into the cities, we see the rise of experience and a focus away from the traditional areas of retail and into some alternatives. As we said, they're still struggling to make ends meet. So when we look at the way retail is growing, and make no mistake, there was positive absorption of 7 million square feet last year in retail. There was negative absorption in only one category, which was the enclosed mall. So the death of retail is highly exaggerated. What we are seeing, though, is a different kind of retail opening up. And so traditionally, the middle market drove retailing. And that would be stores like the Gap and Abercrombie and Fitch and your traditional apparel tenants. The categories in the mall that we call GAFO, it's general merchandise, apparel, furniture, and other. So just think about the things that you go to an enclosed mall for. All of those things are what drove retail development and drove the development of the big box in the 90s going forward until the Great Recession. Since the Great Recession, what we've seen, and if you look at the categories on the left, you'll see discount and variety stores. So that's the Dollar General that you see on the right, who's opening almost 900 stores year to date in 2018. You also see things like apparel. Of those 723 stores, the vast majority are places that are called fast fashion. So now, instead of buying a $15 or $20 t-shirt, you're buying a $4 or $5 t-shirt at stores like Zara, H&M, and Uniqlo, or at Old Navy, which essentially is the off-price version, or originally was planned as the off-price version of the Gap. The interesting one to watch is the grocery store opening. So of those 239 stores, again, if you look to the right, you'll see folks like Aldi are 200 of the 239. Aldi is a German discount grocery store retailer. That sector, which has traditionally been the favorite amongst investors, is increasingly under siege. And it's under siege for a few reasons. One, you have a group of people who are eating out more. Two, you're seeing increased offerings from places like drugstores. And three, it, like the apparel category, is now splitting into a luxury version, which would be the Whole Foods or the Wegmans, and then a discount version with folks like Aldi. So, look, I hate to be a naysayer, but we all looked at food and beverage as our savior. Traditionally in the malls, it was 5% of the square footage in most of our retail. It's going up now in all categories to be between 15 and 25% of all planned square footage going forward. The food hall was looked at as our savior. These started in 2010 when you really couldn't finance anything else. But now, if we look out going forward between 2018, 19, and 20, you'll see there are almost 300 planned in the United States. And we're not sure that there's a market there to support all of that. So that's another sector we'll be watching closely. I don't want to be all doom and gloom, but if we look at it strictly by the numbers, retail's in trouble. The United States has roughly 25 square feet per capita and sales at $500 a square foot. In order to materially increase that square footage, we need to close or repurpose 10 square feet per capita, which adds up to 3.3 billion square feet of space. And to get to the places where Western Europe is, and when we look at development patterns, the US increasingly resembles what's happening in either the UK or France. That could be almost 150% of that. So we're looking at 4.5 or 5 billion square feet of retail that needs to be repurposed. Now, part of that is we're changing the way that we approach retail. So traditionally, we as developers, we didn't want to touch the consumer. We said to the retailer, you do that. You define how customers see our spaces. I'm going to hand you a space with a lease line, and you figure out what happens within it. And so we, as owners, had a fractured relationship with our customers, and we weren't necessarily creating places. We were creating credit-based centers of transaction hubs. Well, along came the internet, and now we've got to reinvent ourselves. So people are using their smartphones within retailers, and we as landlords traditionally, again, said it's us against them. You're either going to the store or you're using your phone. Well, guess what? Our retail partners didn't look at it that way. And so now the rise of this omni-channel retailing, where consumers get a seamless experience across brand platforms, is rising. That's great news for Amazon, right? And that's the first thing that we all think of when folks talk about internet retailing, which is now 29% of that category, GAFO, that I categorized as defining what's in those malls. So on its face, again, there's cause for concern, especially when you feel like there's one participant dominating everything that's happening. But I think if we use the phone industry as an example of where things could go, there's a case to be made that A, Amazon is going to change, right? And so even though they're going into convenience stores to try to get to consumers, which should be a sign for all of us that something isn't working, we have to understand why that is. There's still a reason for all of us to be hopeful, and that is that 54% of sales go to local businesses. And 60% of Amazon's business is unprofitable because of the cost of getting goods from A to B. And while they try to compete on speed, they're costing themselves in terms of profitability. And so eventually, whether you think Amazon is a monopoly or not, and there was a great article in the New York Times this weekend saying that Jeff Bezos should be scared, because the FTC recently hired a woman from SMU to go and look at Amazon's trade practices and begin to discuss whether or not it was a monopoly. But whether or not you believe the government will take action or the market will take action, there's still hope for all of us who deal in traditional retail. The traditional retail side, if you look at what's going on, the market's catching up. This is Walmart.com's new website. And Walmart is a great way to look at where Amazon can't compete. So when you look at the most profitable markets for Amazon, you, like their logo, can draw a smile around the outsides of the United States, and you get all of those urban populations. The inverse is true for Walmart when you look at how the population lives on what I would call the rivers rather than the oceans. And so what you see them doing is the same kinds of things that you're seeing from Amazon. If you look in the center of the screen here, you see 1, free grocery pickup. 2, what's trending near you? What are your friends buying? And then 3, what's happening? If you online ordered, when's your order coming? And how do we serve that? At the top of the screen, you can see they're even taking it to a different place, which is going beyond just showing you goods and services and trying to give you education and advice so that you're making smart purchases and they're capturing more of your basket of goods and spending by becoming a trusted advisor, not just a place for transactions. And that trust and that community is where we believe retail real estate is going. So when we look at what's happening within the retail landscape, we've got retailers who need to create reasons to buy because our customers aren't doing what they used to do, which is just going out and throwing a credit card at it. And our developers aren't able to as quickly fill the space. So they've got to look at different ways to bring people in. And that's true in retail. It's also true in multifamily space and in office buildings where we're seeing higher amenities and for a more savvy generation. The greatest retail places and what this all means have traditionally met that business proposition on the right, but also had a more holistic purpose and a higher purpose of serving as an anchor for their communities. And so what I want to try to do is talk about what we can do to enhance the public realm and use retail as an anchor in traditional and non-traditional spaces. This picture is the fountain at the Grove in Los Angeles. The Grove was a failing farmer's market that was revived, added some traditional retail and a park, and became an anchor for a neighborhood in Los Angeles that didn't have one. And that's great in the big cities, but I think what we're going to see is that's going to be true in the suburbs as well. And as millennials move from the cities into the suburbs, we are seeing new life of retail in different ways. And we're seeing what the millennials traditionally wanted, and the reason that their parents were moving into the cities of that experience, migrate out into the burbs. So when we're looking at policy and economic development, I think it's not just about where can you provide tax incentives for people to locate, but it's about how do you use policy to create experience. So one way we're looking at it is how do you go beyond the lease line? So whether it's the street fair and the tents that you would traditionally see in an urban environment, or something that's a little more permanent, like these shipping container retail pop-ups that are done, how do you use what was blank concrete space to create an event and bring people in? And that's been true of event-driven things like the Boston Marathon on the top right, to roadside attractions like the Renault experience on the bottom right. IKEA in Australia took it one step further. They were trying to figure out how they engage millennials. And so what they did is they branded all of the bus stops in Melbourne with IKEA furnishings and catalog, and then planted ambassadors at certain bus stops in order to talk people through the brand. And so it's not just where we would traditionally see retail being engaged, it's how do we use the entire public realm to create these events and create these social gatherings and social media ready moments for our consumers. It doesn't have to be anything that permanent, right? More cities now have embraced the food truck, but they're still traditionally very difficult for the food truck operators to find places to operate within the current codes and ordinances. And this has two purposes of engagement. One, it engages the community as a whole, but two, as you can see from the cupcake lady, it's taking people who are leaving what were traditional jobs and pursuing something more entrepreneurial. It's giving them a place and allowing the community to support itself in creating a feedback loop of entrepreneurial businesses throughout our communities. In Todmorden in the UK, they've taken this to a totally different level. Incredible Edible was born out of a need, which was in the Great Recession, Todmorden was struggling. And so they started creating free edible gardens around town to feed their population and to bring down the spend of their residents and find a way to build a community. This has become a market that draws from all over the UK. You can go and volunteer and engage in the community. So you go for 2 hours on a Sunday morning, and then in the bottom left corner, you can see they do a potluck lunch with the leftovers of what was harvested in the Unitarian Church. So how do we, as professionals, not only look at just the pure sales dollar, but different ways of inventing community engagement and ultimately creating a farmer's market in places like Todmorden where one didn't exist, by starting a cottage business and allowing it to grow. I think what I'm trying to get across is the traditional patterns of development were driven by Wall Street and private development and what was easy. Instead, what we want to do is figure out how do we as communities come together and define what's authentic, because that is the experiential retail piece, and drive community, and ultimately sales and profitability within our communities. It may be that the traditional model of retail, of single-story retail, doesn't work anymore, and that we need to subsidize that in order to have these civic and public spaces. And so density is another thing to look at, especially in the age of, potentially driverless cars. So do you really need 5 parking spaces per 1,000 or 10 in some locations for restaurants in all of our communities today? Or can you create some kind of pocket parking deck with a few community convenience on-street spaces and service the same groups, creating a hub of activity? One place that's aged really well, and I wish my partner Terry Shook of Shook Kelly could be on the call today, is a project he designed 20 years ago in Huntersville, North Carolina, called Birkdale Village. Now, Birkdale has succeeded as a mixed-use development and lifestyle center where some others have failed, in part because it was attached to a traditional suburban housing development. Well, we all have plenty of those that have no community out front. So is there a way you can recapture part of that space and work with those HOAs to create little downtowns? Because it doesn't have to be a lot. What created Birkdale Village was this pop jet fountain. It wasn't the mix of tenants. It was a place for the children to gather during the day and a place for adults to meet at night. And what it's become is an evolving retail community that's gone from convenience retail to more experiential, and really has become the center, not just of Birkdale Village, but of all of Huntersville. And so for everybody today, what we're going to do when we send out the follow-up materials is there's a video that was made for the 10th anniversary of Birkdale Village. And I look forward to sharing it with you, and please feel free to share your feedback with me on whether or not you think I'm right in terms of whether this is the next wave for all of us for suburban retail. I know time is tight here, and I want to thank everybody. As we think about things, a couple of things I want to leave you with, and then we'll take some questions, which is, one, convenience is less of a factor if store delivery becomes more a part of our lives. So the question here becomes, does that change what we want to do with all of our retail? Yes, probably we need to do something, but it's not what we're doing today, because the experience that people are seeking is not being satisfied by our current retail footprints. And so only by thinking holistically about our consumers and how they work, live, and play are we really going to be able to design spaces that are going to be ready for tomorrow. Thanks, everybody. I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you. Happy to take questions. And contact information for both me and for Terry Shook are here on the screen for any of you who want to follow up directly. Excellent. Elisa, I will turn it back to you. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. Wow, that is really a lot to think about. There's some very interesting points that were made, some really interesting figures as well, and a lot to think about. I see that we're getting a number of questions coming in, and I just wanted to direct people's attention once again to the screen, the questions panel and the GoToWebinar control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. Let's start with a general question on what can cities do? I mean, you do actually discuss this a little bit, but some other kind of practical takeaways on things that you can list for us that cities can do to encourage this kind of mixed use development and encourage the kind of new forms of retail or different forms of retail.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. It's a great question. I think in general, there's a couple of things, which is one, think about density and dynamite. So when we were talking earlier, I alluded to development patterns in the UK or in China even now, where what they've done is rather than going for the traditional sprawl, what they're doing is they're aggregating uses and then reclaiming that space and finding ways to repurpose it. So you've got to think through the problem holistically. So how do we bring tenants together in one hand with our development codes and allow for additional density? And then on the second hand, what do you do with that other space? So in St. Louis, where I am today, there's a group of people where they're allowing them to mow vacant lots and collect money for it. And that keeps them beautified and then makes the overall neighborhoods more attractive for additional investment. So how do we think through sort of what are the root causes of the problem? In my home in Atlanta, for example, we were looking at redeveloping a neighborhood on the west side of the city. And the question wasn't, could we create a job center or could we create a business for people to work in? It was, what did you do for the single parents who needed daycare? And so how do you really get at the root of those social problems and help people solve the impediments that will allow them to go to work and to create productive spaces for our community?
Interesting. Yeah. Great questions. We have a question from Jack on what micropolitan and rural areas can be doing to prepare themselves and make some paradigm shifts.
Yeah, Jack, it's a great question. So I was once working with a retailer and we were trying to plan out a store footprint for them in the rural areas. And they said to me, look, the way that this works is my store manager from 2 towns over drives to the next town and looks and finds a space for me. You can't use the numbers. And I think that's true. What you can use for the micro areas and the rural areas, again, it doesn't have to be anything big. Maybe it's as simple as one plot of community garden that's 3,000 square feet and a shipping container that's retrofit as a community kitchen to use, where once or twice a month it becomes a pop-up for development. Because there is no comprehensive, authentic solution. That's what got us into trouble with too much development. We really got to look at each situation individually. I wish there was an easy answer, but unfortunately, we work in an incredibly complex business, and it's not anything that's easy to simplify.
So I guess on the kind of heels of that, Joe asks, what type of municipal policies promote these types of third places?
Again, another great question. I think in terms of municipal policies, again, we look at sort of building codes in terms of density, use codes in terms of how do you broaden what was a traditional use code, and rather than saying this is a residential area, a retail area, a commercial area, or a rural area, how do you sort of say this is a gathering place? How do you do more planned development codes that allow for the evolution of those spaces and a flexible mix of uses, right? WeWork is growing in the cities by taking down what wasn't traditionally office space necessarily, right? It's become in fashion to take down old industrial buildings and make them office. So how do we sort of write codes? And then the other thing is, how do you create incubators through public-private partnerships to allow entrepreneurial ideas to succeed? Can you give the community a space where they can experiment with anything from a new retail business to having a desk to go to, as a financial planner, where they can interact outside of their homes? How do you draw them together? Right? A cup of coffee costs 8 cents, including the cup. So is there someone who will donate that cup of coffee, which allows people to sit down, right? Howard Schultz was brilliant in his third place because we all love to get together over food. And so how do we, find ways to convene people for different occasions to do that?
Yeah, interesting. I've got quite a few questions coming in. I realize we're a little over time. What I'll suggest we could do is maybe take one more, and then I'll also people have your contact information if they want to reach out to you. A question about whether we'll see a reshoring of the retail supply chain, and is it conceivable that we'll see manufacturing co-locate with retail within a single mall? Manufacturing, a question about office, maybe other kinds of mixed, really mixing those kinds of things together.
So great question. So according to the ICSC, non-retail space in enclosed malls has gone from 19% in 2012 to 23% in 2018.
Wow.
And so that can be anything from services, salons, financial planning, to office space, manufacturing. And I think we're starting to see it in those areas that are the traditional sort of hubs and sparks of innovation. So whether it's Brooklyn in New York or spaces like Citizen Supply at Jamestown's development in Atlanta called Ponce City Market, we are absolutely seeing manufacturing within retail spaces and people wanting that authenticity. And it's even more holistic than that. So in Brooklyn, I was with somebody the other day and we went to a knife skills class where you learned how to use your chef's knife and then could place an order and go back with the chef and make your own knife to take home in a separate blacksmithing class.
Wow. That sounds so Brooklyn. I love it.
Yeah, it's totally Brooklyn, right? So, but I think a lot of our communities have opportunities. It may not be making knives, but whatever their authentic thing is, whether it's gardening, refurbishing cars, making furniture, I think there's huge opportunity for those kind of co-locations, and that people will pay for that.
Fascinating. A lot to think about. Okay, well, I look forward to seeing these kind of creative, articulations or expressions of what mixed use might look like in malls near us. I think that sounds very exciting for the consumer as well. I will remind you that we will be sending out a link to the recording of this within the next couple of days, so check your inboxes. Matthew will be able to send out the slide deck as well. I'll set that up on SlideShare. We can maybe send a link to that, so if people have questions, they can take a look at that. And of course, you'll have our contact information. Myself and Matthew's will be included in that email, so you can reach out if you have any additional questions. Matthew, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate that, and I think we all really enjoyed this presentation. You've given us a lot to ponder in the days ahead.
Well, thanks for the opportunity again, and best of luck, everybody. I look forward to hearing more of your questions and hopefully talking to you soon.
Thank you all very much, and have a great day. Bye-bye.